It seems at the end of Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics that Aristotle's account of the virtues is completed. He's talked about the virtues that are responsive to reason, which are the virtues of character. And he's talked about the virtues that involve the exercise and the operation of reason itself, which are the virtues of thought. Isn't he done? Well, it turns out that the answer is no. First of all, because there's a possible objection that could undermine the whole account. Aristotle claims that the virtuous person not only knows the right thing to do, but desires, wants, always to do the right thing, and therefore does it. The objection would be that this theory corresponds to little or nothing in reality, that it's an unrealistic idealization. In real life, the objector might say, even good people struggle, at least sometimes, with doing what they know or believe is right. Even the good person struggles quite often with desires contrary to what he knows he ought to do. Some people, philosophers, have even thought that the distinctive mark of the good person is the ability to control and keep in check his recalcitrant desires. This would be a kind of heroic virtue that triumphs in the struggle against oneself. However, for Aristotle, the person who has self-control in this way is distinct from the person who is truly virtuous. The virtuous person doesn't need to control his desires. They control themselves, so to speak. Or better, they don't overreach beyond their appropriate boundaries because they've been properly trained to remain within those boundaries. They desire just so much, namely the appropriate amount, and no more. Well, the good person who does good only through self-control is less worthy in Aristotle's eyes than the truly virtuous person. Also, the person who lacks self-control and merely lacks self-control is less bad than the truly vicious person. He's not vicious, the person who lacks self-control. He's merely weak. This is a familiar phenomenon that we call weakness of will. The Greek word for it is akrasia, literally lack of control or lack of command. The English translation of this term, akrasia, is notoriously problematic. We could, but we don't want to use weakness of will. The reason for this is that it anachronistically presupposes that there's something called the will that's part of our psychology, which is not part of Aristotle's moral psychology. That is, it's a later Christian development, most associated with St. Augustine. So that's problematic. Just weakness might work, but it's a little bit vague and imprecise. Or we could say lack of self-control, but that's a bit wordy. So those are other options. The one that Irwin suggests and uses is incontinence, which has the advantage of being like akrasia, a single word. And it alludes to the situation in which you just couldn't contain yourself or hold yourself back. It refers to this idea of lack of containment, and that's good. The problem is, in modern English usage, of course, it's come to connote the lack of voluntary control over urination or defecation, which is the first definition in my computer's dictionary, possibly yours as well. So that's unfortunate, but this is Irwin's choice, so we have to live with it. So we'll refer to incontinence. Broadly speaking, there are three conditions that must be met for a person to be incontinent in Aristotle's sense. So an incontinent person, we could say, meets these three conditions. First, they know the right thing to do. That would be the first. The incontinent person is always going to know the right thing to do. They're not going to be ignorant. But second, they desire something contrary to the right thing. They may desire the actual opposite, or they may just desire something that's inconsistent with choosing the right thing. And then third, the incontinent person acts on their desires that are contrary to the right thing. Acts on their desires. So those are the three characteristics of an incontinent person. They know the right action to do, but they desire something contrary to the right action and act on those contrary desires. That is the incontinent person. As we'll see, for Aristotle, the desires here are primarily, or in the paradigm case, the same cases that pertain to the virtue of temperance, namely the desires that pertain to the pleasures of the senses of taste and touch. Those pleasures that he associates particularly with our animal nature. But whereas the temperate person has trained or habituated these desires to be limited within proper boundaries, the continent or incontinent person has not. Recalcitrant desire is the key factor in incontinence. Desire for more food or drink than a temperate person would consume or want to consume. Desire for sexual gratification from a shameful source, one that a temperate person not only would not indulge in, but wouldn't even be tempted to indulge in. That's the difference. The incontinent person is thus distinct from three other cases of interest to Aristotle that form the main subject of this chapter, or part rather, of the Nicomachean Ethics, namely the cases of the virtuous, the continent, and the vicious person. The virtuous, the continent, and the vicious person. So the continent and the incontinent stand between the virtuous and the vicious, being neither as good as the virtuous, but not as bad as the vicious. And obviously, for Aristotle, it's going to be better to be continent than to be incontinent. So we can graph this way, and this is a rather common way to lay this out. So we can compare these four different states, the state of virtuousness, continence, incontinence, and viciousness, by mapping or charting how they would respond differently to three distinct questions. So first of all, the first question is, does the person know the right thing to do? The second is, does the person desire to do the right thing? And the third is, do they do the right thing? So these are our three questions. Does the person know the right thing to do? Yes or no? Does the person desire to do the right thing? Yes or no? And does the person do the right thing? Yes or no? And so in this way, we can distinguish between the cases. Just use abbreviations for lack of space here. The different answers. We'll abbreviate them this way. So how would the virtuous person, that's VT, how would the continent person answer? How would the incontinent person answer? That's I. And how would the vicious person answer? That's VC. So, virtuous person. Does the virtuous person know the right thing to do? Yes. Oops. We'll use red and green. How about that? Yes, the virtuous person certainly knows the right thing to do. Does the person desire to do the right thing? Again, yes. The virtuous person wants to do the right thing. That's what they want to do. And then does the person do the right thing? Yes, of course. The virtuous person also does the right thing. So we have a perfect score from the virtuous person. They know the right thing to do, they desire to do the right thing, and they do the right thing. How about the continent person? Does the continent person know the right thing to do? So scattered throughout this part, I won't cite all the passages here, they're pretty obvious and apparent if you read the chapter. Aristotle's quite clear, although there's a question about it that we'll talk about later, but on the whole, Aristotle consistently holds that the continent person has to know the right thing to do. So yes, the continent person is someone who knows the right thing to do. Does the continent person desire to do the right thing? And here's where we get the first strike. The continent person, in fact, does not desire to do the right thing. The continent person is troubled by and struggles with contrary desires contrary to doing the right thing. So the answer there is no. Does the continent person do the right thing? And here, again, the answer is yes. The continent person is the person who is able to overcome their contrary desires, to exercise self-control and do the right thing. Next to our title case, the incontinent person. The incontinent person, does the incontinent person know the right thing to do? Yes, once again, the incontinent person knows the right thing to do. They know the right thing to do. Do they desire to do the right thing? Well, again, like the continent person, the incontinent person doesn't desire to do the right thing. And the incontinent person also, unfortunately, lacks the ability that the continent person has to exercise self-control. And so they don't do the right thing. They follow the desires that lead away from the right thing. So that's how they differ from the continent person. Both have knowledge of the right thing to do. Both desire to do the wrong thing. But whereas the continent person succeeds in overcoming those contrary desires and doing the right thing, after all, the incontinent person fails, gives in to desire, and does the wrong thing. And then finally, the case of the vicious person, the worst person. The vicious person doesn't know the right thing to do. The vicious person has a twisted way of thinking, you'll recall from our account. They're imprudent, they lack practical wisdom, they don't understand what the good is. They follow things that appear good to them, but because of their poor character, they desire bad things, or they reason in a way that's base and shameful to get things. For example, cheating someone in order to get money. They think that money is the be-all and end-all, and so they cheat people to get it. So they don't, in that sense, they don't know the right thing. They have the wrong conception of the right thing. And so, of course, their desires are not going to possibly map onto what the right desires would be. They're not going to desire the right things. And in that situation, of course, it's hopeless, except by chance, that they would actually do the right thing. So the vicious person is clearly the worst person. Not only do they not know, they don't desire, and they don't act on correct desires. So we can see that the incontinent person, as sorry a case as this is, at least the incontinent person knows the right thing to do, which the vicious person cannot appreciate because of their corrupted character. So the incontinent person has at least that small advantage over the vicious person. Okay? So that's the basic layup. I'll put this up one more time so you can see. This is the basic way in which we define the virtuous person in contrast to the continent person, in contrast to the incontinent person, and in contrast to the vicious person. And from here you can quite clearly see the descent in moral worth that goes from the virtuous person to the continent person, to the incontinent person, to the vicious person. Aristotle notices a number of puzzles and perplexities that arise with this notion of incontinence. First, there are puzzles concerning how it is so much as possible to know what to do and yet not do it. And these have to do with Socrates' famous position, which is known in the literature as Socratic Intellectualism. So sometimes you'll see this referred to in this way. The position is that to know the good is necessarily to do the good. Most famously, Socratic intellectualism is characterized as the position that no one does bad things willingly, but only through ignorance. That's Socratic intellectualism. No one does bad things willingly, but only through ignorance. This will be a fundamental problem for Aristotle, arguably the fundamental problem of this part, because it will require a deep dive into some fundamental questions of moral psychology, especially the nature of the knowledge that is involved in moral action and how it is involved. So that's the first sort of puzzle that he deals with, those connected with the idea of Socratic intellectualism. Second, there are puzzles concerning the proper scope and range of incontinence. What desires does it concern? How does it concern them? How, for example, is incontinence different from merely being a soft or passive person, unable to offer resistance? So that's the second set of problems, puzzles concerning the scope and range of incontinence, what it concerns, what desires it concerns, how it concerns them, how it's different from just being a kind of a milksop type person, a kind of a weak person, or a person who's just kind of a wanton person who just can't resist their desires because they are unable to offer resistance. Third, there's the problem of distinguishing continence and incontinence from the outwardly similar cases of temperance and intemperance. Related to this is the question of how much moral blame an incontinent person deserves for their incontinence. We do, in fact, tend to blame a person for their weakness of will, but not as much as we blame them for their vicious character. Why is this? On the other side, it would seem necessary to have an account for why we blame the person at all. Why not treat moral incontinence like the medical condition of incontinence? We don't blame people if they lack the ability to control urination and defecation. Why isn't this kind of incontinence, the inability to control your desires, something that is just a purely physiological condition that we're not responsible for at all? Yet it seems like we do blame people to some extent, not the same extent as we blame a person who's vicious, but we still blame an incontinent person. So Aristotle is going to try to sort out the reasoning, the justification for these different ways of assessing incontinence, natural conditions, and the state of viciousness. And fourth, there's the problem of distinguishing the paradigm cases of incontinence from cases that involve incontinence in some more extended sense, which Aristotle will also recognize. By the end of this account, we see that the earlier account of the virtuous person that we've been focusing on was indeed an idealization. There's a kind of tacit admission on Aristotle's part that this was an idealization. His theory of the virtues, in fact, is a theory of how ideally the virtuous person should be. The virtuous person should always know the right thing to do, should always desire to do the right thing, in the right way, to the right objects, in the right manner, in the right circumstances, for the right duration, and so forth. And you should also actually desire to do it. So that's the way the virtuous person ideally should be, always knowing the right thing to do, always desiring to do only the right thing, and always actually doing it. However, in reality, real people, even good ones, only approximate the state of perfect virtue. Even though it's rarely, if ever, perfectly instantiated, Aristotle wants to show that his theory is not, therefore, unrealistic, because it provides the standard by which we measure actual cases. The more an actual person matches the standard, the more virtuous and hence the better person he is. And in some rare cases, he will even say it may be possible for someone to attain the state of perfect virtue, which is akin to becoming a god, he suggests, at the opening of Book 7. The way Aristotle broaches the topic of incontinence is by listing it as a condition of character to be avoided, along with vice and bestiality. So, in the opening of Book 7, he says, in the area of character, there are three conditions to be avoided: vice, incontinence, and bestiality. The contraries of two of these are clear. We call one virtue and the other continence. The contrary to bestiality is most suitably called virtue, that is superior to us, a heroic, indeed divine sort of virtue. Thus Homer made Priam say that Hector was remarkably good. Quoting Homer here, nor did he look as though he were the child of a mortal man, but of a god, unquote. If, therefore, human beings are gods, as they are said to do, because of exceedingly great virtue, if human beings become gods, as they are said to do, because of exceedingly great virtue, this is clearly the sort of state that would be opposite to the bestial state. For indeed, just as a beast has neither virtue nor vice, so neither does a god. But the god state is more honorable than virtue, and the beasts belong to some other kind than vice. Now it is rare that a divine man exists. This is what the Spartans habitually call him whenever they very much admire someone. They say, divine man. Similarly, the bestial person is also rare among human beings. He is most often found in foreigners. But some bestial features also result from diseases and deformities. We also use bestial as a term of reproach for some people whose vice exceeds the human level. The point of this seems to be to acknowledge the human condition, that the human condition is one that is intermediate between the gods and beasts, and that it is rare, though possible, for us to attain either the heights of divinity or the depths of bestiality. What does this have to do with incontinence? It suggests that the struggle with some degree of incontinence is the normal condition for humanity. Aristotle states here that his interest in investigating the topic of continence and incontinence is to distinguish them from the states of virtue and vice. In his opening chapter, Aristotle lays out the method that he will employ to further his investigation. So this is a famous passage in section 5, page 118 in our text. As in the other cases, we must set out the appearances, and first of all go through the puzzles. In this way, we must prove the common beliefs about these ways of being affected. Ideally, all the common beliefs, but if not all, most of them and the most important. For if the objections are solved and the common beliefs are left, it will be an adequate proof. So what's he talking about here? Well, he says he will set out the appearances, that is, the way that the phenomena of continence and incontinence appear in ordinary life, manifest to everyone. And also the things that people ordinarily say about them, expressing the common beliefs about continence and incontinence. Because he thinks people sometimes confuse continence and incontinence with virtue and vice or other conditions, we need to sort through these beliefs about continence or incontinence in order to separate out the important ones, the ones that we want to keep, the beliefs that we want to keep as part of our theory, and distinguish from those beliefs that will need to be discarded as confusions. For example, the belief that continence and incontinence are a part of virtue and vice will be a belief that, well, some people hold it, Aristotle will want to deny. and suggests is based on a confusion. So he says this is around 1145b15, second half of section 6. People think that the temperate person is continent and resistant. Some think that every continent and resistant person is temperate. Others deny it. Some people say the incontinent person is intemperate and the intemperate incontinent with no distinction. Others say they are different. Sometimes it is said that a prudent person cannot be incontinent, but sometimes it is said that people are prudent and clever but still incontinent. Further, people are called incontinent about spirit, honor, and gain. These then are the things that are said. There's this further issue here that he slips in here when he refers to the resistant. And here he's thinking of another opposition that is easily confused with the opposition between the continent and the incontinent. That is the self-controlled person, the person who lacks self-control, namely the person who is, as we might say, tough, which he calls the resistant person, the person who's tough, versus the person who is soft. So what's the relationship, he wants to say. So he's going to have a separate account of that idea. Aristotle doesn't think that you deserve moral praise just for being tough. Or necessarily moral condemnation merely for being soft. It sort of depends, I think, on how you got to that state. But if you're, say, some people are just naturally tough. They're naturally more resistant to natural pressures and pains, typically, than other people. So it's not obvious that the person who is tough is to be praised over the person who is soft. Whereas for Aristotle, it is more obvious that the person who is continent or has self-control is to be praised over the person who is incontinent or lacks self-control. And so the reason for this is going to be that the opposition between continence and incontinence is going to have more to do with the involvement of reason, as we'll see shortly. So we see here 3 potential areas of confusion to be sorted out. 3 main areas. First, is there really any difference between continence, incontinence, and temperance, intemperance, those 2 oppositions? So that's the first and primary thing. Is there really any difference between continence, incontinence, and temperance, intemperance? And that really goes to the heart of Aristotle's understanding of the nature of the virtues as involving one's desires as well as one's reason. Second, can a prudent person be incontinent? Can a prudent person be incontinent? And third, what can one be incontinent about? Can one be incontinent about honor or gain as well as in the pleasures of the gustatory and sexual appetites? So that's the third one. What can one be incontinent about? Can one be incontinent about honor or gain as well as the pleasures of the gustatory and sexual appetites? Notice that the appearances or common beliefs about incontinence that Aristotle mentions do not include any expressions of skepticism that incontinence is a real phenomenon. Common sense takes it as obvious that there is such a phenomenon as incontinence. They appear manifestly, according to Aristotle. That's at 1146a28. It's manifest. It's obvious that there is such a thing as weakness of the will, lack of self-control, incontinence. However, this view was famously denied by Socrates, as we noted. So Aristotle takes note of this at the beginning of chapter 2. This is page 118. We might be puzzled about what sort of correct supposition someone has when he acts incontinently. Remember, that's one of the conditions of the incontinent person is that they do know what the right thing is to do. They have some kind of correct supposition, Aristotle's referring to here, about the right thing that they should be doing. But we might be puzzled about what sort of supposition someone has when he acts incontinently. First of all, some say he cannot have knowledge at the time he acts, for it would be terrible, Socrates used to think, for knowledge to be in someone but mastered by something else and dragged around like a slave. Knowledge is the thing referred to here that is mastered. For knowledge to be mastered by something else, by the appetites, and dragged around like a slave, that That doesn't jibe with our understanding of knowledge as being this sort of divine factor in the human being. That would be Socrates' attitude. For Socrates used to oppose the account of incontinence altogether, in the belief that there is no incontinence. For no one, in Socrates' view, supposes, while he acts, that his action conflicts with what is best. On the contrary, our action conflicts with what is best only because we are ignorant of the conflict. So, Socrates thought that reason is in control of the soul. Nothing is superior to knowledge, is the way Aristotle puts it. If that's true, that reason has control of the soul, then it makes no sense to say that the desires or appetites or emotions or passions or pleasures overpower reason. Hence, Socrates concludes that the only way to explain why a person does wrong is to say that he was ignorant of the right thing to do. But as we've seen on Aristotle's scheme, that would make him a vicious person, whose reason is corrupted by misplaced wishes and wrong ways of thinking. So if Socrates is right, then there is no genuine incontinence. There's only ignorance, the ignorance that's characteristic of the vicious person. And this Aristotle thinks has to be wrong. So continuing on section 2 there, top of 119. This argument then contradicts things that appear manifestly, and we ought to ask if ignorance causes this way of being affected, what type of ignorance it proves out to be. For it is evident at any rate that before he's affected, the one who acts incontinently does not think he should do the action he evidently was. Certainly we know phenomenologically there are people who think, I really shouldn't have that extra piece of cake. I really shouldn't sleep with my brother's wife. They know that. They appear to have the correct belief, but then they do it anyway. What's going on here? And so there's a real puzzle here that Socrates is pointing to, because has the person lost their mind? Have they really lost their reason? Because the most straightforward way to understand the desires, appetites, emotions, passions, or what have you, overpowering reason, is for the person to go mad, to go insane, temporarily insane. But Aristotle would say, well, that doesn't match the appearances. And Socrates would agree with that it doesn't appear to be the case that the person, when they, let's say, give in to temptation, goes crazy. They appear to be just as sane as they were before. Although, in a sense, they are doing something irrational, we would want to say, at some level. But that's precisely the philosophical problem, is to explain in what sense this person is acting irrationally or ignorantly or whatever. Because it is a puzzle. How is it that reason can somehow, as it were, take a holiday in these cases of incontinence? But it seems like reason hasn't totally checked out. I mean, the person hasn't totally gone insane. So we hesitate to say that the person's reason was overpowered by emotions or passions. Of course, the person might try to say that to excuse themselves, but generally speaking, other people don't accept that. They view it as a form of self-deception. The person says, I couldn't help myself. I was just so passionately drawn to your wife. Sorry, bro. The brother typically isn't going to accept that as a form of temporary insanity. So that's the problem. But again, Socrates thought that reason has to be in control. Nothing is superior to reason. We can call this the primacy of reason or the primacy of knowledge. And I think the best way probably to think about the relationship here is that reason, as we've seen before in this text, is for Aristotle the way in which one arrives at knowledge. And so knowledge could be viewed as a kind of product of reason or a successful, stable result that reason arrives at. As we'll see, Aristotle is going to say that it doesn't really matter whether we're thinking about true knowledge here or just stable belief. So we can also, I think, indifferently talk about reason as long as we mean that the person has arrived at some kind of stable result of reason. And isn't just uncertain in their deliberations. That would be a different situation. If, I don't know, is it right or wrong for me to sleep with my brother? That would be a different situation than someone who knows it's wrong or has a stable belief, or at least a stable belief, if not knowledge, that it's wrong and does it anyway. That's incontinence. Not someone who's unsure whether they should sleep with their brother. In fact, typically we would regard someone who has to deliberate about that as being a paradigm case of a vicious person. Who has someone with a poor character who has to deliberate about whether he should sleep with his brother's wife or not. So Socrates concludes that the only way to explain why a person does wrong is to say he was ignorant of the right thing to do. But that, again, is, on Aristotle's scheme, what makes you into a vicious person, if you're ignorant of the right thing to do. And as a vicious person, you are to be condemned. We might be reminded here, incidentally, of these issues that were discussed when we were talking about the theory of voluntary action in Aristotle. Of, is a person really responsible if they were ignorant in this sense of what the right thing to do because they had a vicious character, because they were raised by, a person who, Johnny Soprano or whoever, who gave them a bad idea of what truly is good and evil, and so they're, were born under a bad sign and had an unlucky upbringing and so forth. Is that person really responsible and so forth? So, but we just got to take for granted in this context that makes sense, that view of moral responsibility makes sense, that we can be understood to be responsible for our vices. And so, on Aristotle's scheme, to be ignorant of the right thing to do is to be a vicious person, to be more blameworthy, not less. Your reason is corrupted by misplaced wishes and wrong ways of thinking when you're vicious and you're ignorant. So if Socrates is right, then there is no genuine incontinence. There's either just viciousness or virtuousness. And if you're a virtuous person, you do the right thing. If you're vicious, you do the wrong thing. And there's no in between. There aren't those in between columns in our chart earlier. There's only ignorance, the ignorance characteristic of the vicious person, no incontinence. And this, Aristotle thinks, must be rejected as manifestly false, as we said. Certainly there are cases of people who know the right thing, but have contrary desires and give in to those desires. So that is what we need to understand. How is that possible? So Aristotle says in the next section there, section 3, some people concede some of Socrates' points, but reject some of them, for they agree that nothing is superior to knowledge, but they deny the claim that no one's actions conflict with what has seemed better to him. That is why they say that when the incontinent person is overcome by pleasure, he has only belief, not knowledge. So you see here the beginning of someone trying to struggle with the idea that Socrates has something right in his view that knowledge has to be primary, that a person can't sort of claim that their knowledge was overcome in these cases of incontinence. So maybe the way to solve this is to say, well, the person didn't really have knowledge, they merely had a belief. And as we'll see, Aristotle doesn't think that this is going to help. In the next section, he says, however, if he has belief, not knowledge, and the supposition that resist is not strong, but only a weak one, such as people have when they are in doubt, we will pardon failure to abide by these beliefs against strong appetites. In fact, however, we do not pardon vice or any other blameworthy condition, including incontinence. So again, it's not enough to say, well, maybe they just have belief, not knowledge, because what do we mean by that? Do we mean they had a strong, settled belief, one that's reflective of their character? In that case, we will blame them. Do we say that, well, they were uncertain? They were just working it out. They were deliberating. And is it the kind of case where that's a reasonable thing that even maybe a virtuous person would have to deliberate to discern what the right thing to do and wouldn't have a stable belief? Well, in that case, we're not going to blame a person if they're giving into a desire or what have you when their belief isn't set yet. The problem is, though, there seem to be cases where people have strong, firm beliefs, beliefs that for all intents and purposes act as knowledge, and yet the person does something contrary to those beliefs. So the problem is a bit of a tricky one, it seems, to solve. If Socrates is right, and the supposedly incontinent person doesn't know any better, then it makes no sense to blame the person for how they acted. And yet there seem to be cases in which we assume that the person did know better and acted wrongly anyway. So we blame the person. And Socrates' review requires us to deny these judgments. So this leads to the first discussion question. Do you agree with Socrates that no one does wrong except through ignorance? Is Aristotle correct to repudiate Socrates on this point, while agreeing with him that knowledge and reason are the superior force in the soul? Do you think that reason can ever truly be overpowered by emotions and appetites? Why or why not? So that's the first discussion question. Once again, do you agree with Socrates that no one does wrong except through ignorance? Is Aristotle correct to repudiate Socrates on this point, while agreeing with him that knowledge and reason are the superior force in the soul? Do you think that reason can ever be truly overpowered by emotions and appetites? Why or why not? Aristotle raises some additional puzzles that arise if one equates continence with the virtue of temperance and incontinence with the vice of intemperance. First, if continence is just temperance, since prudence is involved in temperance, it, that is prudence, must be the thing that's successfully resisting contrary appetites in the case of continence as well. But it doesn't make sense to Aristotle for such contrary appetites to even exist in a prudent person. So he says, this is in section 5, center of section 5. This is strange, for on this view, the same person would be both prudent and incontinent, but no one would say that the prudent person is the sort who does the worst actions willingly. If it's possible for a prudent person to be continent, it must also be possible for a prudent person to be incontinent. And that means it's possible for a prudent person to do wrong actions willingly, and for Aristotle, this is nonsensical. Moreover, the continent person has excessive and base appetites, but the temperate person has neither of these things, as he says in section 6. Also, Aristotle points out that the moral consequence of continence and incontinence, unlike prudence and imprudence, doesn't track true and false beliefs. The prudent person is virtuous because he has true beliefs, and the imprudent person is bad because he has false beliefs. However, the continent person merely controls his appetites according to whatever beliefs he happens to have, which may be false beliefs about the good and the bad. If his beliefs are in fact false, his continence may make him a bad person, which would be an absurd consequence for the prudent person. So, you think about the cool criminal who's able to restrain, let's say, his lust for the sake of, perpetuating a seduction so that he can obtain some kind of riches through some kind of con game that he's running. The person who's able to be self-controlled in that sense because he has false beliefs. But his continence, his self-control leads him to be a bad person. And that would be an absurd consequence for a prudent person, for the prudent person's prudence to lead them to be a bad person in the way it allows him to control his appetites. Conversely, the incontinent person doesn't control his appetites according to his beliefs. Thus, if those were to be false beliefs, the incontinent person might conceivably live an equivalent life to the continent person who acts on true beliefs. Again, it could never be the case from Aristotle's point of view that the imprudent person could live a life equivalent to that of the prudent person. That would be absurd. But it's not absurd for the incontinent person with false beliefs to live a life equivalent to a continent person with true beliefs. So again, it appears that the continence-incontinence distinction doesn't map onto the prudent-imprudent distinction. And hence, it doesn't map onto the virtuous-vicious distinction. In short, what these examples tend to show is that prudence is not the same as continence, imprudence is not the same as incontinence, and thus virtue and vice need to be distinguished from continence and incontinence. In the third chapter, Aristotle gives his theory of incontinence. Evidently, this theory is intended to explain how it is possible for the appetites and passions to do an end run around what reason dictates, without reason being overpowered or giving into or agreeing with the appetites and passions. That's what we're trying to do. How is it possible for the appetites and passions to, speaking metaphorically here, do an end run around what reason dictates without reason being overpowered, giving into, or in any way agreeing with the appetites or passions. As in the case of a mad person, reason might be overpowered by the appetites, or as in the case of a vicious person, reason might agree with appetites or passions that are bad. We're talking about reason, again, rather than knowledge, because in Aristotle's argument, it doesn't matter whether the incontinent person goes against something they know or merely against something that they have a strong and stable belief about. His argument would still go through in either case. And he makes this point in sections 3 and 4, page 121 of chapter 3. Aristotle doesn't think it will work as an accommodation to Socrates to claim that incontinence is always due to a weak and wavering belief that the person has. If a person acts contrary to the way they believed before, because they just changed their mind, their belief changed, that's not true incontinence. So, for example, if before I resist committing an act of extramarital sex, because let's say I'm a fundamentalist Christian, and then I move towards deconverting from fundamentalist Christianity, or I'm on the fence, I no longer have a strong and stable religiously based belief that it's wrong to sleep with someone outside marriage, and therefore I sleep with someone. That is changing my mind about a moral belief, or changing the strength of that belief, or the stability of that belief. That's not incontinence for Aristotle, even though it can look kind of like incontinence. And of course, someone who is a cynic might say that, well, the reason you changed your belief is because you were incontinent and you wanted to give into your sexual appetite. But Aristotle wouldn't consider it that way. He'd just say, look, if your belief hasn't stayed stable, then we can't count it as a case of incontinence. Instead, Aristotle's theory of incontinence will rely upon two distinctions concerning knowledge and belief. First of all, there's a distinction between active and inactive. Knowledge and belief. Section 5, he says, page 121, but we speak of knowing in two ways. We ascribe it both to someone who has it without using it and to someone who is using it. Hence, it will matter whether someone has the knowledge that his action is wrong without attending to his knowledge, or he both has it and attends to it. For this second case seems extraordinary, but wrong action when he does not attend to his knowledge does not seem extraordinary. So you have lots of beliefs that are not currently activated. For example, if I asked you, you probably agree that you believe that you have lived longer than 1 year. However, that belief, I assume, was nowhere in your mind a minute ago. So you have lots of beliefs that are not active. It's the difference between whether you're attending to it. In that case, it's an active belief. But if you're not attending to it, you may still have the belief somewhere in the back of your mind, but it's not an active belief. So that's the first distinction between active and inactive beliefs. And his distinction also relies upon a distinction between universal, different color here, and particular knowledge and beliefs. So in section 6, he says, further, since there are two types of premises, someone's action may well conflict with his knowledge if he has both types of premises, but uses only the universal premise and not the particular premise. For it is particulars that are achievable in action. There are also different types of universal, one type referring to the agent himself, the other referring to the object. Perhaps, for instance, someone knows that dry things benefit every human being, and that he himself is a human being, or that this sort of thing is dry, but he either does not have or does not activate the knowledge that this particular thing is of this sort. These ways of knowing and not knowing then make such a remarkable difference that it seems not at all strange if someone acting against his knowledge has the one sort of knowledge, but astounding if he has the other sort. So, if we translate this into the moral sphere, if I hold a belief that one should help a person who's struggling to get up, and I'm nearby, but I lack the particular belief that that person is struggling, or I lack the belief that I'm near enough to help them, then I won't help. But it's not because I have altered any moral belief I have. I still believe, and believed all the way through this scenario, that I should help a person who's struggling to get up. The action depends upon a judgment about a particular situation. I will help only if I have the particular beliefs that this particular person is struggling to get up and that I am near enough to help. So what Aristotle is saying is that there seems to be a lot more instability and variability and vulnerability to chance and circumstance and things like that when we're talking about particular beliefs. The universal beliefs tend to be pretty stable. It's rather surprising if someone would become ignorant of some general moral truth that they've always held, like it's a good thing to help people get up if they've fallen and have trouble getting up. That would be very unusual if I lost that universal belief. But the particular beliefs are ones that it's much easier for me to, as it were, overlook or forget or miss or not perceive and so forth. And he notes that typically sense perception is responsible for one's beliefs about such particulars. And the senses, as we know, are notoriously fallible and imperfect. When a universal belief and a particular belief are combined, then it's necessary that the conclusion follow immediately. So the combination of the universal and particular belief is what's traditionally called a syllogism. So we have this idea that the universal and the particular belief are combined in what's traditionally called the practical syllogism, which involves a major premise, which is the universal belief or knowledge, a minor premise, which is the particular belief, and then a conclusion, which in the practical case is going to be an action. So this is what we have when we have the universal and particular knowledge combined. We have a major premise, a minor premise, and then they're brought together, and that when these are two are brought together, it issues in an action. Aristotle thinks that rationality dictates that one immediately accepts the conclusion. If this is just a theory, if I'm just talking about theoretical beliefs that don't imply anything about the way one should act, then rationality would immediately lead you to accept the conclusion once you saw that these two were combined. But in the practical case, I combine them practically by acting on them. If a syllogism concerns a belief about action, the conclusion that follows is an action, which must be immediately performed. Thus, the practical syllogism. The claim that the action must be performed is an expression of the idea of rational necessity. It's reason that dictates immediately performing the action. Just as reason would dictate immediately drawing a theoretical conclusion when the syllogism is purely concerned with theoretical beliefs. Otherwise, you'd be irrational if you combine the major premise and the minor premise and didn't draw the conclusion that would logically follow. So, of course, it's possible for either the universal belief or the particular belief to be absent or inactive in a particular practical circumstance. And this will, so to speak, break the circuit that leads to the action. So we need an example here. We'll go back to my example I gave before. So the major premise might be the universal belief that one should help a person who has fallen down if they are able-bodied and near enough to the person, say. So that represents my moral belief. I would say a piece of moral knowledge. I know that one should help a person who's fallen down if you're able-bodied and near enough to the person. That's the major premise. The minor premise would be something like, this person here right? So it has to be a particular situation now. So I'm pointing to a particular person who I perceive has fallen down. Of course, my perception could be an error, right? Maybe they just bent down to pick up a penny or something, but I'm making the judgment that this person here has fallen down. I'm making the judgment that I'm able-bodied, again, based on sense perception. I feel I'm all right. I think I can help him up. And I make the judgment that she's near enough for me to help. So that's the minor premise. And then the conclusion is going to be the act of helping her. So that would be an example of a practical syllogism, where I reason that one should help a person who's fallen down if they're able-bodied and near enough to the person. This person here has fallen down. I'm able-bodied and she's near enough to help, and therefore I help. That's the practical syllogism. See the distinction there between the universal belief, the general principle, and the particular belief. The universal belief says one should, in general, help a person who's fallen down, etc. The particular belief says this person here has fallen down, etc. Now, if I don't believe the person has fallen, if I don't see her, or if I believe my bad back is acting up today, and I would injure myself by trying to help, or if I believe that I'm too far away to help, then the syllogism won't come into effect. The circuit will be broken, so to speak. But notice, my moral belief remains. I still believe the same thing I believed before. One should help someone who's fallen down. But it's inactive in this situation. And notice how the minor premise, or the particular belief in this syllogism, relies upon sense perception and memory. I see the woman on the ground a block away, or I don't. That depends on sense perception. I sense a telltale crimp in my lower back, or I don't. Depends upon sense perception. I remember how long it will take me to walk that distance, or I don't. So whereas the first belief might depend upon prudence, this general belief, the second is always going to depend upon sense perception. And these are the two crucial distinctions then that Aristotle makes regarding knowledge and belief. The distinction between active and inactive knowledge, and the distinction between universal and particular beliefs. To these, Aristotle adds an observation about the way in which strong feelings can affect the way in which we have knowledge or belief. In particular, how it can render a belief or piece of knowledge inadequate. So as he says on section 7 there on page 122, further, human beings may have knowledge in a way different from those we have described. For we see that having without using includes different types of having. Hence, some people, those who are asleep or mad or drunk, both have knowledge in a way and do not have it. Moreover, this is the condition of those affected by strong feelings. For spirited reactions, sexual appetites, and some conditions of this sort clearly both disturb knowledge and disturb the body as well, and even produce fits of madness in some people. Clearly then, since incontinence are also affected by strong feelings, we should say that they have knowledge in a way similar to these people. Okay. So we're now in a position to see how Aristotle attempts to account for the phenomenon of incontinence. And he explains this in the passage that begins in section 8 and continues through section 13. Now, saying the words that come from knowledge is no sign of fully having it. For example, I could say that I believe that one should help people who have fallen down, but saying that doesn't mean I really possess it as knowledge. For some who are affected in these ways can even go through demonstrations and recite verses of Empedocles, and those who have learned something do not yet know it, though they string up words together, for it must grow into them, and this takes time. I can spout the words of true moral universal beliefs and truths without really having it grow into me as part of my character. That seems to be what he's saying. Further, we may also look at the cause in the following way, referring to human nature. For one belief is universal, the other is about particulars, and therefore perception controls them, the particular beliefs. Perception controls the particular beliefs. And in those cases where these two beliefs result in one belief, that is in the case of the practical syllogism, when they're combined into one belief, in those cases where these two beliefs result in one belief, it is necessary in one case for the soul to affirm what has been concluded, but in the case of beliefs about production, to act at once on what has been concluded. If, for instance, everything sweet must be tasted, and this, some one particular thing is sweet, it is necessary for someone who is able and unhindered also to act on this at the same time. Notice this sounds like the example of the kind of reasoning of an intemperate person. Everything sweet must be tasted. So here's the donut, so I guess I got to eat it, right? So this is an example of a virtuous person's practical syllogism. Suppose then that someone has the universal belief hindering him from tasting. Now we're getting into the example of the incontinent person. He has the second belief that everything sweet is pleasant and this is sweet. And this belief is active, but it turns out that appetite is present in him. The belief then that is formed from the previous two beliefs tell him to avoid this, but appetite leads him on, for each of the parts of the soul is capable of initiating motion. The result then is that in a way reason and belief make him act incontinently. The second belief is contrary to correct reason, but only coincidentally, not in its own right. For the appetite, not the belief, is contrary in its own right to correct reason. That is also why why beasts are not incontinent, because they have no universal supposition, but only appearance and memory of particulars. How is the ignorance involved so that the incontinent person recovers his knowledge? The same account that applies to someone drunk or asleep applies here too, and is not special to this way of being affected. We must hear it from the naturalists, the natural scientists. Since the last premise is a belief about something perceptible and controls action, this is what the incontinent person does not have when he is being affected. Or rather, the way he has it is not knowledge of it, but as we saw saying the words, as the drunk says the words of Empedocles. What does he have in mind here? Aristotle's view of incontinence seems to depend upon two factors. First, the ability of sense perception to produce a particular belief. And second, this particular belief's ability to render inactive the particular belief that would activate the proper practical syllogism. So, for example, take the case of someone trying to diet. She might encounter a bag of donuts that her partner left on the kitchen one early morning. And she reasons, fatty food leads to excess fat storage on the body, hence ought not to be eaten. That would be the universal belief or the major premise in the continent syllogism that I'm imagining here. These donuts are fatty. That would be the particular belief, minor premise. Hence, they ought not to be eaten. So this is the way she reasons at first. Constantly exercising self-control to maintain her diet. Fatty foods lead to excess of fat storage on the body. Hence, they ought not to be eaten. That's the universal belief, the major premise. Second, these donuts are fatty. That's the particular belief, the minor premise, and hence they ought not to be eaten, which she expresses in her actions. She leaves the kitchen, leaves the donuts alone. However, a couple hours later, when she's more hungry, when her appetite is stronger, her sense perception is affected by this. And she becomes more aware of the delicious appearance of the frosted donut. Her memory is activated by her sense perception, which of course has a power in the soul. And so she remembers, boy, those donuts sure look good. She becomes more aware of the delicious appearance. Maybe she goes into the room and looks at them. So now she's being affected by her sense perceptions. And instead of the particular belief, these donuts are fatty, which she still has, it's not like she's forgotten that the donuts are full of fat. But now that belief is inactive. Right? It's no longer active. It becomes an inactive belief, particular belief. An inactive, particular belief. The belief that these donuts are fatty. And now a new belief arises from sense perception, which is again, indeed true. Eating one of these donuts would taste sweet. That's the new belief that arises. And now the circuit in the original continent practical syllogism that the person was reasoning that led her to leave the kitchen, that circuit is broken because the particular belief that these donuts are fatty has now become inactive and has become replaced as her attention has come to focus on the new particular belief, which is also true, that eating one of these donuts would taste sweet. The circuit is broken because we might say that the one belief has been crowded out by another particular belief. But it's not so much a matter of forcing as it is just a matter of shifting attention, rendering the first belief inactive and the second belief now active. And we can see where this is going to go. Now another syllogism arises. Something like this, close to what Aristotle says here. Sweet tasting foods are pleasant to eat. That's the major premise. The universal belief. Sweet tasting foods are pleasant to eat. The particular belief, eating one of these donuts here would taste sweet. Eating one of those donuts would be pleasant. And so then the person draws the conclusion and eats a donut. So on this picture, it's not that desire overpowers or overcomes reason, but rather that sense perception produces a particular belief that commands the person's attention in such a way that momentarily the circuit in one line of reasoning is broken and thus rendered inactive. Or rather, the circuit is broken because the belief is rendered inactive as attention shifts to a second particular belief. And another line of reasoning takes place in the mind. So on this theory, as I'm interpreting it here, incontinence relies crucially on a distinctive feature of our human nature, namely that our attention is limited. Our attention is limited. You can be as rational and adept at reasoning as you please, but you can really only focus on one line of reasoning at a time. This makes it possible for sense perception to weigh in the balance and influence our choice of which line of reasoning we're going to focus on by influencing what particular beliefs command our attention. That's the function of sense perception. As with our responsibility for our vices, according to Aristotle at least, we can see here how we can be responsible for incontinence. In other words, we're responsible for incontinence if we have developed bad habits of reasoning. People, we say, lose focus, but they can develop tendencies of losing focus that get reinforced by allowing themselves to continue losing focus in this habitual way. Tendencies of losing focus on the appropriate line of reasoning because they've developed slack habits when it comes to practical deliberation. Habits of not staying focused on the line of reasoning that leads to prudent courses of action. This is why you'll often find, I think, various forms of mindfulness training and meditation as parts of anti-addiction therapy and things like this, because mindfulness is supposed to allow you to keep focus, to keep that original practical syllogism that led you to leave the kitchen in your mind and not get distracted by what your sense perception is presenting to you as another belief. Also, from this interpretation of Aristotle's account, we can see why blame is a sign for incontinence. Because reason is involved, reason that is under our control, is involved at 2 points in the process that leads to an episode of incontinence. First, reason directs the sense perception that increases the desire, and this causes the particular belief. Reason directs the sense perception that increases the desire, and this causes the particular belief. It's true that maybe you can't help if the thought of a donut just spontaneously pops into your head, but you decide to focus on that or not. You decide to build upon that idea. And typically, we do this by, for example, giving ourselves excuses for why it's all right for us to continue to think about this and so on. But reason is at some point typically involved in increasing the desire because it's reason that's focusing sense perception. And certainly this is obviously the case if you make the decision to go into the kitchen to look at those donuts. Your reason is directing your sense perception. And second, so that's the first one. Reason is directing the sense perception that increases the desire and that causes the particular belief that leads to the episode of incontinence. And second, reason focuses on the particular belief that is unhelpful, and this distracts attention from and renders inactive the particular belief that's helpful. There's nothing that's stopping this woman in my example from, instead of thinking about how delicious donuts are, which is true, instead focusing on the donuts being fatty. Right? So there's a certain blameworthiness involved. Why are you allowing yourself to focus on how delicious the donut is instead of focusing on how fatty it is? Why did you let that belief become inactive? reason focuses on the particular unhelpful belief. So Aristotle believes this answers Socrates' concern about the primacy of knowledge, since in this case, the universal knowledge is not in any way overcome or overpowered. Rather, it's only the particular belief, which is tied to sense perception, that is put out of order, so to speak, by another particular belief. So he says, this is the second to last paragraph of the chapter on page 123. And since the last term does not seem to be universal or expressive of knowledge in the same way as the universal term, the result Socrates was looking for would seem to come about as well. For the knowledge that is present when someone is affected by incontinence is not the sort that seems to be fully knowledge, nor is this dragged about because he is affected, but only perceptual knowledge is present. That is, the person who is subject to this case of incontinence didn't lose their knowledge about what would happen if they ate the donut. They didn't lose their knowledge about the desirability of dieting to maintain health and so forth, or whatever the reasons are for their wanting to diet. So the universal knowledge remained, but what changed was this more variable particular belief, that these beliefs that are not fully knowledge in Aristotle's way of understanding it, because the fully knowledge, the belief that has the character of full knowledge is going to be this more universal, more stable belief. And that fits, I think, our ordinary intuitions too. I mean, we're more inclined to think that something like, the law of gravity or something is more fully a piece of knowledge than my belief that if I drop this, it will fall down. So that's kind of what he's getting at there. So that for him is acknowledging the point that Socrates had, that knowledge can't be affected in cases of incontinence. This leads to the second discussion question. Does Aristotle provide an adequate theory of incontinence, one that both preserves Socrates' commitment to the primacy of reason and yet explains how someone could act against their knowledge or considered belief about what's the best thing to do? Why or why not? So once again, second discussion question. Does Aristotle provide an adequate theory of incontinence, one that both preserves Socrates' commitment to the primacy of reason and explains how someone could act against their knowledge or considered belief about what it's the best thing to do? Why or why not? Okay, so we're almost done. I just want to cover some of the these lesser issues that Aristotle considers. We'll go through these quickly. For Aristotle, there is a central or paradigm case of incontinence, and then extended or metaphorical senses of incontinence. The central case is the person who's incontinent in the same way as the intemperate person is intemperate, and about the same things. So we see this on in 1147a, 19 through 20 on page 121. In other words, the incontinent person is incontinent about the desires for satisfaction of the senses of taste and touch, paradigmatically gustatory and sexual pleasures. Someone might say that it's possible to lack control in one's desire for wealth or honor, or to lack control when it comes to controlling one's anger. And Aristotle allows that there can be a sense in which one can be money incontinent, or honor incontinent, or anger incontinent. However, he would insist that this is a qualified and derivative sense of incontinence. The primary case is incontinence regarding bodily pleasures. What's the reason for this? Well, it seems to be that it's because pleasure and pain are the things that are to be contained by the continent person. And this, Aristotle seems to be thinking, concerns the appetites more directly than those other things. You can see information about this in chapter 4, section 4. This also explains the connection between incontinence and softness. A person is considered soft if they are particularly susceptible to pleasures and pains, more than is normal. You see this discussed in chapter 4, section 4, and also in chapter 7. Incontinence is contrasted with the bestial state by the fact that when human beings are reduced to a bestial state, nature is the cause, and they no longer have moral responsibility for their actions. In these cases, something like a depraved natural character or madness is the cause rather than the reason of the person. Again, there's a kind of continence that Aristotle calls stubbornness, which is just a kind of strong-willedness, having a strong will, being a willful person in that sense, regardless of whether the principle the person is following is the true one. So there are people who are just stubborn in their ignorance, stubborn in their mistaken beliefs, stubborn in their immorality. But again, he regards this as the derivative case, not the paradigm. In the paradigm case, the continent person does follow the true belief, and the incontinent person fails to follow the true belief that they actually have. So you can see him discuss this. This is 1151b4 on page 132. So in sum, both the continent and the incontinent person at least preserve and keep alive the moral principle, the true moral belief that's also followed by the prudent person. In this, they are superior to the intemperate who lack the true belief about the good. However, the continent still falls short of the virtuous because of their untamed appetites.